Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My guest today is Ron Padgett, award-winning poet and biographer. Thank you for being here. And you're a lot of other things besides that, Ron.
Bon vivant, yeah.
You do a little bit of all things, but of course you've written so much poetry and have gotten a lot of acclaim for that. You hear of very few overnight successes when it comes to poetry. How did you sustain yourself in the early years? And I'm not talking about financially. We've all heard the starving artist stories,
Yeah.
but how about emotionally?
Well, emotionally, I actually never had trouble being a poet. By the time I was 16, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I had the approval of my father, which was quite unusual.
That is unusual.
Yeah, yeah. And also I had good friends my own age, an artist named Joe Brainard, who lived in Tulsa, and I knew. Friend of mine, and the kid who lived across the street from me, a guy named Dick Gallup, was a poet also. He was a year older than me. So the three of us were buddies, and we palled around, and I think we formed a little mutual support group, and that helped a little bit. But I was always I never had any doubt about the whole thing.
And you didn't worry about making a living. My family was always very concerned that I wouldn't be able to make a living as a writer.
Yeah. Oh yeah, when I announced to my father one day that I was going to be a poet, well actually he asked me what I was going to do in life. I was 16 and I said, I'm going to be a poet. And my father, who was a bootlegger, sort of paused and said, okay, all right. And then he said, well, how are you going to make a living? And I said, I don't know, I'll figure out something. And he said, okay. And that was that simple.
See, wasn't it wonderful that he was that accepting of it?
It really was. It's remarkable, considering he had no literary background, and poetry to him was just like what?
One of your important mentors was Kenneth Koch. What did you learn from him?
Oh gosh, Kenneth Koch, when I went to New York to go to university, he was one of my first professors there, and I took a year-long humanities course with him, reading sort of the great books of the Western world. And he really completely blasted away my prejudices about literature and just widened my sense of the possibilities in literature so enormously. Forever grateful to him. And then we became friends after that, and we're friends until he died.
You mentioned one piece of advice he gave you about lightening your work a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he actually just showed me that I didn't have to be so darn serious all the time, and that in fact, not only was humor and comedy something that was normal to life, but that it actually had its serious side too. And so I wasn't so grim all the time in my personal life. When I wrote poetry, I tended to get a little serious, and by sort of lightening up, it actually, I think, brought a little fresh air into my work.
I've been looking through one of your poetry collection, Great Balls of Fire, and there's a poem here, Jet Planes, one line, flies across the sky, and then there is another poem here, December, I will sleep in my little cup.
Yeah.
Lovely, lovely poems. What makes a poem?
Oh gosh, well there's so many different kinds of poems, it's hard to answer that question simply, but in general, I'll give you a real blanket answer. There's a kind of a feeling of shapeliness and completeness in the little, whether it's a small poem or a big poem. But the variety of poetry is so enormous, thank goodness. And from different poems from all over the world in different poetic forms, and free verse and experimental verse and abstract verse and nonsense verse and children's verse. There's so many different types. But all of them that are good share this feeling of unity and completeness and giving the reader a kind of satisfaction.
How do you know when a poem is finished?
Oh,
like the jet plane.
Well, jet plane. I wrote this poem, Jet Plane. It simply says, jet plane flies across the sky. I wrote that for my son, he had just been born. And I thought, I'm going to write a really simple poem that, would be really easy to understand. So I tried to use very small words and very few words. And that was over pretty fast, actually. As far as others, it's a gut feeling you have when you finish something. Now, when I'm drafting something, sometimes I write beyond the end of the poem. I keep going too long. But later, when I go back and look at it, I'll cut off the end and the extra stuff that I added on. But then finally, when something feels right, it just feels right.
You write at a computer?
I do now, quite a lot, yeah. Yeah.
Did that change your style at all, or your sense of timing with your poetry?
A little bit. I sort of missed the scritch, scritch, scritch of the pen on paper a little bit. But on the other hand, writing with a computer sort of, the words on a computer are behind a screen and behind that glass window. So you're a little cut off from them, and it was hard for me at first to feel the words because they were this shield between us. But then I found also that the way, the way on a computer words can just disappear and fly off and be erased so easily, and you'd never know they'd been there. That sort of freed me up in a funny way. It's like you get into the playground of the computer, and it didn't seem to matter so much. And that actually allowed me to try things and do things that I might not have tried otherwise.
I remember that Howard Nemeroff said once that one problem he had when he wrote it at a computer was that he lost his sense of timing, and he tended to go on more than he wanted to.
Yes, it's very easy to do that. Yeah.
Because he was so used to page breaks into that space, and he somehow couldn't convert his eye of the poem to the computer screen.
A lot of poets are conditioned by the physical space they're working on. An 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, for instance, or a particular notebook. Or if the page is real wide or real narrow, you tend to write things to fit that. Over the years, I noticed how many, before computers, how many poems there are. There are tons of them that are about this long. You know what I mean? And they don't run over on the next page. And that's simply because the poet had a feeling for that's the field that you can work in. And you stop when you get near the end of the page.
One of your most recent poetry collections is You Never Know, and you generously agreed to read The Drink from this.
Oh yeah, just to give, instead of hearing me blather on,
we give a sense of your poetry, and of course we hope everybody will buy your collections. And how many collections have you published, Ron? Oh,
I can't answer that. I don't remember.
That's true success.
No, there's a bunch of them. But the truth is, when I write or publish a book, and I'm sort of finished with it. I mean, I go back occasionally and look at them again and actually revise things sometimes. But I'm more interested in what I'm working on now or what I'm going to work on. I don't really think too much about the things that I've done. Maybe I don't want to. But anyway, this is just a short piece. It's actually a poem in prose. Your question about what makes a poem be a poem, this is another form of poetry, I think. It's called The Drink. I'm always interested in the people in films who have just had a drink thrown in their faces. Sometimes they react with uncontrollable rage, but sometimes, my favorites, they do not change their expressions at all. Instead, they raise a handkerchief or napkin and calmly dab at the offending liquid as the hurler jumps to her feet and storms away. The other people at the table are understandably uncomfortable. A woman leans over and places her hand on the sleeve of the man's jacket and says, "David, you know she didn't mean it." David answers, "Yes," but in an ambiguous tone. The perfect adult response. But now the orchestra has resumed its amiable and lively dance music, and the room is set in motion as before. Out in the parking lot, however, Elizabeth is setting fire to David's car. Yeah, this is a contemporary film.
How has your poetry evolved over the years?
Oh, has it evolved? I don't know if it's any better or worse. But I did figure out something about that recently, was that I've finally gotten old enough that I actually feel I can write anything I want to now, without anything looking over my shoulder, anybody looking over my shoulder. I'm not. I just go in to and sit down and write now, and I don't have any ideas in mind. I don't have any theories in mind. I don't maybe have any themes in mind. I'm not writing for anybody. I'm not writing against anybody. So it's kind of nice, actually. I don't know if that's a form of evolution, but
how's it affected your writing?
Well, it's gotten nuttier, for one thing. But it's interesting because this past summer I wrote about 40 poems, actually, of which about 5 were not too bad. And about 5 were sort of not too bad, and the rest were awful. But the beauty of this method is that nobody will ever see the awful ones because I'm going to hide them. But in the things that I liked, were some new developments for me. I don't know how or why I wrote them, but I think that's one of the joys of this way I do things now.
Could you give us an example of some of the new developments?
Well, I wrote a bunch of poems in rhyming couplets this summer, and I haven't done that for a long, long time. And also I wrote a poem that is really depressing, And it was so much fun to write a very depressing poem.
Well, I'm sure because of the change. How did you reach this place? Because writers are known for being very critically sensitive, and I know I always was nervous when my books would come out and I would wait for the reviews. How did you reach that point, that stage where you didn't look back over your shoulder?
Well, it wasn't that I was worried about critical reviews, because that's completely out of my hands. I can't control that. I can't control the price of gasoline either, so I just don't worry about it. It seems pointless. But I think if you just write long enough and publish some things, and then you get some praise and you get some criticism, that after a certain point in your life you realize that praise and that criticism is not going to make any difference either one. And the work itself has to just be what it is, and there's no sense in worrying about the whole thing.
And you enjoy what you do, don't you?
Oh, I guess so.
You don't go through the angst and have writer's blocks and things like that?
I've gone for long periods without writing, yeah, and even gotten a little worried about it. But then if that hasn't happened for me for quite a while. But yeah, I get a little angst sometimes, sure. But
how do you work through it?
Oh, I give myself some writing assignments, or I tell myself, look, Ron, go in your room, shut the door. You cannot come out of that room until you've written 5 poems. I don't care how good they are, how bad they are, how long or short. You have to write 5 pieces before you can leave the room. And you break through the writer's block pretty fast.
How good a judge are you of your own work?
Oh dear. I try to be hard on my own work, I know that. And I have a wife who's a very good, close reader of my work, and a very no-nonsense person when it comes to telling me what she thinks about it. And she's always been that way. So I think I'm pretty good, because I've learned how to detect my own blarney, you know. And it's taken a while to figure it out. But I've had good friends who are close readers, and they've proved their friendship again and again by being very honest with me about my new work. And that's really helped me a lot. But I try to, if I can't figure out if it's any good or not, it might be an interesting piece, you know.
Sure, good way to look at it. You recently published 2 memoirs, and I'd like to talk about them. But first of all, I wanted to ask you about the fact that you've written about both of your subjects in poetry first. Did that make it easier for you to write in an extended format?
I don't think so, no. Writing memoirs for me, which is something I never really thought I'd ever do, I don't see any real close connection between that and the poetry that I've written that mentions, well, the 2 in question about my father and about my friend Joe Brainard. No, I don't think so. They feel very different to me.
Let's talk about the one about your father first, Oklahoma Tough, subtitled "My Father, King of the Tulsa Bootleggers."
Yeah, well, that's what he was known as around here. Yeah.
How old were you before you were comfortable, you know, sharing his profession with your friends?
Oh, I think by the time I got out of high school, I was perfectly comfortable with it. When I was smaller, a little kid in grade school and stuff, I didn't want the other kids to know. No, I knew there was something a little bit funny about the whole business. But in my heart of hearts, I didn't think there was anything wrong with what he did. He was my daddy, and I loved him. And so he seemed fine to me. And
he was such an interesting man. I like what Elmer Kelton said in describing this book, and he writes about your father, and he says, you know, he was a contradictory mix of high principles and criminality.
Yeah.
And I thought you might, you know, speak to some of the other paradoxes about the man.
Well, he could be the most protective person on earth. I mean, I felt really safe having my father be my father, because he was a big, tough, fearless guy, and nobody was going to mess with him or his family. So I always felt very protected with my father. On the other hand, and he was also very kind. On the other hand, he could be if he was messed with, don't cross him, because he could be your worst enemy. He had an amazingly funny sense of pranksterism. He was very, very funny in that way, and yet a lot of people knew him only as the gangster. He could be very sweet and very nice, or he could be very naughty. Either one. You wanted to be his friend. You didn't want to be his enemy. And if you were his friend, he would do anything for you.
In the preface of the book, you say that you began the book as a biographer and you ended it as a child. Was that your hope and expectation all along, or did that surprise you?
It surprised me. It surprised me. I'd never written a book like this. I was really going into uncharted territory for me. And after I'd wanted to write a book about my father when he was alive. In fact, I wanted to write one with him. But he said, no, son, I know too much about too many people, and people would get hurt if I told everything I knew. He meant physically hurt. And she said, after I die, you can write anything you want. And after he died, I did. I really launched into this project of writing a book about him. I wanted to create a kind of monument for him. So I began doing all kinds of research and writing down my memories and talking to my mother and his friends and his enemies and looking at his FBI files, which was 1,300 pages, all kinds of records and documents. And I kind of approached it I tried to be professional about it and impartial. And of course that was impossible because I was his son, and then gradually this bond grew between us as I wrote the book.
Don't you wish he could have known that?
Yeah, I think secretly he would have been pleased in some funny way, although he didn't like publicity. He liked to just keep things nice and quiet.
That's an occupational hazard, publicity in history.
He preferred that the Tulsa papers not write about him.
When you went back and researched him, you mentioned going through the FBI files. Did you find anything out that surprised you?
I was surprised by how inept the FBI was and how little they knew about him. Actually, that really shocked me. How they thought, for instance, that I lived in, what country did they put me in? I can't remember, Brazil or something. I'd gone to France, and they had a lot of small details, wrong. Yeah, I learned some things about him. I learned that later in his life, after he gave up bootlegging and got into, actually he had a lot of legitimate business as well, but he got into some forms of crime that were not quite so colorful to me and frankly were disappointing to me. And I learned about those later, after his death. And so that made my heart sink some. It didn't lower my love for him, but it did make me feel disappointed that he the second half of his life hadn't had a happier course to it.
How do you work through those feelings, because you can't talk to him at that point?
No, you can't. You write the book and you cry a little bit sometimes, and that's about it.
How did your family feel about you writing this book?
You know what? I got great support on that. My mother, she was incredibly helpful. My father's mother, who was still alive, she lived to be 98, and who had a crystal clear memory, long-term memory. She was very helpful. Every family member that I talked to, virtually every family member, was really, really nice and helpful, and were excited about it.
Were you uneasy at all about repercussions among his old gang of friends?
A little bit, yeah. But I didn't say anything about anyone that wasn't among those criminal cronies. That wasn't public knowledge anyway.
Have you heard from any of them since?
A couple, yeah, and they loved it.
Isn't that nice?
Yeah, they loved it. Yeah.
And then your latest memoir, Joe. Tell us about Joe. Introduce him to the audience if they may not be as familiar with his work.
Well, Joe Brainard was like me, a Tulsa boy, and we grew up and knew each other here. And in high school, we edited a little literary and art magazine together, publishing Tulsa writers and Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and people like that. And we were only 16 years old at the time. And then we went to New York together, and Joe became an artist, and I became a poet, and we were steadfast friends until the day he died.
Tell us a little bit about his art.
Oh, Joe Brainard was a fantastically talented, brilliant artist who had many wonderful shows in New York, was included in all sorts of group shows and museum shows. His work's in the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and he was surrounded throughout his life by really knowledgeable, interesting, great people in New York who knew just how good he really was.
In many ways, the book's a story of your friendship. He was gay, you were straight. That didn't seem to matter at all.
No.
What was the strength of your relationship? What made you kindred spirits?
Well, I think partly it was because we both came out of the same neighborhood in Tulsa, and we were the same age. We had been in first grade together at Whittier Elementary School, and in fact, he grew up in the neighborhood where my father grew up. We just had a lot of things like that in common. And then, as I said earlier, we kind of were buddies in high school, and close buddies. And he became great friends with my wife too. I think that really contributed a lot. And the fact that we stayed friends. You know, it's one thing to make friends, but it's another thing to stay friends for so long. And we managed to do that without taking each other for granted too much, and without having our relationship just lock into a particular space. That is to say, we gave each other room to get older and to grow and be different. And I think Joe appreciated the fact that ultimately that I and some of his other friends, we didn't care if he was gay or not. And in fact, we didn't know he was. I already loved and admired this guy before I learned he was gay. So it didn't matter to me one bit.
What made you decide to do the book?
I guess it was something like what happened when my dad died too. I mean, these were people that were very close to me, and I particularly with Joe, I didn't want him to just disappear from the world. And I started writing down little things I remembered about him. I didn't intend to write a whole book, by the way. I just thought, I'll write down a few things about Joe that I remember. I don't want to forget these things. And I wrote more and more and more, and then I thought, oh, I better check. My wife said, no, that didn't happen then. And it just started growing and developing, and before I knew it, I said, oh my God, I'm writing a whole book here. And then this is the result, 350 pages.
Yeah, and he died of AIDS. Did you know as he was going through his last days that a book would eventually be written?
No, I didn't.
You didn't even start on it at
No,
all?
I didn't even think about that, no.
I wonder if you found some comfort in the book as you wrote it, because it had to be a great loss in your life. You know, here's somebody who's been your kindred spirit all these years. It's no easy way to reconcile that.
No, not really. I mean, I guess I did a lot of the things that people do when they're grieving. But I at some point it did strike me that I had to do something more than just grieve. I had to do something for him. And that's the result. But you know, a lot of people of his friends in New York had a similar impulse. And there have been all kinds of events and retrospective traveling shows of his work and panel discussions and magazines devoted to him. I mean, I'm not the only one who felt that way about him.
How would you like him to be remembered?
Oh, as one of the most compassionate, sweet, intelligent, interesting, brave people I've ever known, which is what he was.
Did he and your dad share any overlapping characteristics? Can't help but wonder.
I don't know. You know, it's funny because my dad loved this guy. And Joe, when he was in high school, was very, very meek. He was very shy. He stuttered. And he was skinny and kind of nerdy and totally macho. And on the other hand, my father, you know, he was 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, solid muscle, tough guy, you know. And my father just loved Joe. He thought Joe was absolutely terrific. And Joe thought my dad was tops. It was so funny to see them together, how different they were.
Well, and Joe was also a pretty contradictory mix himself, like your dad.
In a lot of ways, yeah. Well, the most interesting people are.
Yeah.
I mean, well, everybody's complicated. I mean, everybody. But these guys were really complicated.
How overwhelming was it for you to sit down to write the story of your father and then the story of your lifelong friend?
Actually, Teresa, it was very overwhelming.
I would think so.
Yeah, because I felt a huge responsibility toward them. And I was not a professional biographer or memoirist. This was not an area I'd ever written in extensively. So yeah, I went through a lot of doubt and anguish and wondering, am I going to do this well? Am I doing this right? It's a big responsibility. It's not like writing a few poems here and there, which to me is a different kind of responsibility. But this one, I mean, they're all serious, but all these responsibilities are serious. But this was, I spent many a sleepless night working on these books.
Oh, I'm sure. And after the book came out, say Oklahoma Tough, and you read it or you thought back on it, did you say to yourself, gosh, I should have included this and I didn't,
of course.
Or I shouldn't have included this and I did?
Yeah. I'm like those writers. They publish a book and the first thing they do when it comes out in print is they start revising it. I'm always tinkering with things. There are a couple of things I should have put in, I might have put in the book. Well, actually, the book about my father was originally almost twice as long. It was way too long.
They had to be awfully hard to cut out passages.
It was, but I have to say I got very good editorial advice from the University of Oklahoma Press, and they really helped improve that book, I think, a lot. And it helped me, subsequently, that helped me write the book about Joe. They had a wonderful copy editor who worked with me there. It was very helpful.
If you could add one more thing to the book about your father, Oklahoma Tough, what would it be?
Oh, gosh. Let's see. I've had an answer for all your questions, and that one stumps me. One more thing. I don't know, to be really honest with you.
Well, then that's good because you have a sense of completion about it.
Pretty much on that one, yeah.
What about the memoir of Joe, because that's more recent?
Yeah. Oh, this is very recent. So, although I worked so hard on that book, on the Joe book, that I can hardly see it anymore. I mean, I pick it up and look at it and read it and just go blind. It's too new. It's like a baby that's just been born. You kind of look at it and you kind of go, oh my God, look at this thing. So I'm still in that phase of it. The glare of the newness of it is still on me.
How did you research his life when you start looking at his life as a biographer, and in addition to that, you're his friend, and you have all this knowledge about him based on your relationship with him? Did you go out and visit with other friends to get a broader sense of that?
I did. I talked with a lot of people, but also I'm one of the executors of his estate, so I had easy access to letters that he had written to people, and people loved him so much they saved his letters, thank God. And so people very generously sent me photocopies of his letters. I have thousands of pages of his letters, and I have all the diary pieces he wrote, and pieces of writing he did that he never published. So I had a lot of access to information that made it a lot easier for me to work on.
And you include that in the book, which makes for an interesting format, a lot of that.
Yeah, Joe was such a good writer that who could not quote from this material and let Joe speak for himself as much as I could. So that's really, actually that was a challenge because Joe's writing is so much better than mine. I thought if I quote him too much, it's going to make me look bad.
But I bet it was a wonderful sense of being close to him again, wasn't it? To focus on him.
It was.
How long did it take you to write the memoir?
About 6 years. I mean, not day and night, obviously,
sure.
But I worked on it about 6 years.
So it didn't come easily,
as
we talked about
it.
You had to struggle through and decide.
Well, it just growed, as Topsy said. I mean, it just growed and growed.
It just grew.
And so I didn't know actually how long it was going to be until I sort of got done, and then I looked at it and saw what I had done.
Was it hard to let the book go when you did reach the completion stage?
It was hard because I wasn't sure that I had done justice to him. And I was wondering, should I wait? Should I wait? Should I wait? And my wife said, no, you've worked on this thing too long already. Go ahead and publish it. It's fine. I said, really? And she said, yeah, there are other things for you to write now. So it was time to stop.
Ron, congratulations on these two wonderful memoirs, with all you've done with your poetry. Thanks for being here. And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.
Jackie Cooper Volvo supports numerous community projects and is proud to be a sponsor of Writing Out Loud.